This is the XF30mm RLMWR 2.8 macro lens. This is a really awesome lens. I don't get excited about too many lenses these days, if I'm being honest, but this is one lens that I am really excited to do a short review on for you guys, and you should really consider picking this lens up if you haven't already. Before we get started, big shout out to FujiFilm for sending me both the XF30mm and the X-T5 to play with for a few weeks. I always appreciate you guys. And in case you are wondering, I am filming this video on the X-T5 with the 23mm 1.4, the Gen 1 version. So if the autofocus is good, these new camera bodies are even bringing the Gen 1 lenses back to life. Let's run down the specs. This is a 30mm lens or a 45mm equivalent. It is an f2.8 to f22, insanely light, weighing in at 6.9 ounces or 195 grams. It has a baby thread size of 43mm and an MSRP of $600. But the craziest spec of this lens is the minimum focal distance, which on paper is 4 inches or 10 centimeters. But if I'm being honest, I don't think this lens has a minimum focal distance. More on that later. In terms of the build, size, and weight, let's talk about a few things here. First, this is a super small lens. It is an absolute delight to walk around with for some street photography, especially when paired with the X-T5. It's such a light setup, it is zero burden to carry around. In terms of materials, this lens has your standard metal aperture ring and focus ring. Pretty much the rest of this lens is made with plastic. Basically everything that is not one of these rings is made of plastic. This doesn't take away from the performance at all, but it just doesn't make the lens feel as premium as your standard FujiFilm lens, but it does make it really light. One tip that I found worked really well for this lens was to keep the lens hood on the entire time. So even with the lens hood on, it really doesn't add that much more to the lens in terms of height, especially it doesn't add anything in terms of weight. If you use a camera strap and you sling it around your back or onto your side, this lens hood just gives you a little bit of protection in case you bump into something. Of course, you should be super careful with your gear, but just in case, it's a nice little barrier protection and it really adds nothing to the lens. No weight, not really too much height. And one thing that is super funny is how small the lens hood is of this lens. It is a baby lens hood. It's actually the same lens hood that the GF50 has. If you are using this fancy lens hood / lens cap combo on the 50. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw it in there. And jumping into image quality and everything along those lines, since this is a macro lens, let's talk about the macro first. If you watched my XF kit video, you'll know that I already own the XF80mm macro, and that is a phenomenal lens. I love that lens so much. It might be my favorite lens of all the XF lenses that I own. The reason being is it's just an overall amazing lens. It's my main go-to when I'm shooting XF in the studio. It is, of course, a phenomenal macro lens. It's just an overall great lens, kind of an all-around lens, if you will, and I really love using it. So, as you would expect in trying out this new XF30mm macro, I have some pretty high standards. And honestly, I didn't really know what to expect. I didn't really think it could come close to the 80. What I didn't expect to find with this lens is that there is just really no minimum focal distance. And it sounds insane to say, I understand that, but the only limitation that you will have is the lens shadow, meaning that you will start focusing on something and you will get so close to the subject that your lens will essentially cast a shadow on the subject depending on which way the light is going. It's pretty wild, and I've never really encountered anything like this aside from putting different modifiers and magnifiers on my XF80mm, but that was a long time ago and I was kind of just experimenting. This is native glass. If I recall correctly, I believe the 80mm also played a similar game with the minimum focal distance. On paper, it was just larger than it was in real life, which is pretty interesting. It's definitely something that I won't complain about. Here are some macro shots that I took with this lens. And we have to always talk about bokeh when doing a lens review. So this lens, for being a 2.8, has some pretty serious bokeh. It's also a little unfair because being a macro lens, you could just get hyper close to a subject and then the rest of your background, as you could imagine, just is obliterated. Bit of an advantage for this lens, but nevertheless, the bokeh is pretty nice. Let's take a look at a few bokeh examples. And jumping into sharpness, so you can get really close to your subject with this lens, and it has really great bokeh, but how sharp is it? Well, the answer is this lens is pretty sharp. I know, at this point, what doesn't this lens do? And to answer that question, what this lens just quite simply cannot do, well, it doesn't have fingers, so it can't hit that subscribe button. But I know you can. If you're not subscribed and you are enjoying this video, please consider helping me out, hitting that button. Now, let's jump into a bit of pixel peeping in Lightroom just to check out the sharpness. So we're in Lightroom now. Let's take a look at a handful of photos, specifically talking about the sharpness. Starting with this picture of Piper the cat. So if we zoom in here, we're at 200%. I'm pretty new to using these newer 40 megapixel cameras, so I can't 100% speak to the zoom level. Typically, I'm used to zooming in to 200% on the XH1, and depending on the scenario of the photo, it can be super sharp at 200%. Here, it's looking like, at 100%, that's kind of our threshold. 200 is not really usable, like to post on Instagram or whatever. But also, I think this was a slight crop. Yeah, this is a slight crop. So that being said, just talking about 100%, this is super sharp. Onto this picture of this flower. So this was shot obviously outside on a rainy day. And if we click and zoom in at 100%, this looks great, really solid. If we bring the highlights all the way down, we could see that we have all this information, nothing is lost here. And if we zoom into 200%, I think you have some, like this part definitely holds up well. The part that was in focus, not super crispy at 200%. This may not be like the ultra sharp lens that the XF80 is. It's still very sharp. This looks good at 100. I mean, this looks great. And again, just as a PSA, we're obviously heavily pixel peeping here, but it's for science. Onto this flower. Now, this was shot obviously wide open. I believe all the other photos were as well. Naturally, there's a very shallow depth of field here. Only this flower is in focus. So if we zoom into 100%, looks pretty sharp. We even got this hair or whatever it is on the plant in focus. And zooming into 200, I mean, this is definitely really nice. Super sharp. I think this is a really quality result. This lens has a cheap price tag, but it really does pack a punch. Moving on to this photo. So 100% zoomed in. Bokeh is super nice, but we're not talking about that now. And I'm not sure what type of flower plant this is, but at 100%, super sharp. At 200%, still pretty sharp. I mean, this is the limit again. I don't think, this is a usable shot, maybe with a little bit of noise reduction or AI enhancement. It could be fine. Zooming into this image here, again, I'm showing pretty extreme images with heavy drop off, but that's also a testament to how well the lens is built. Zooming into 100 here, pretty solid. At 200, again, same sort of scenario we've just looked at. You definitely have a bunch of detail in the leaf for sure. And this is just a hyper narrow depth of field. So an image like this, I would expect to be sharp pretty much edge to edge. This is my experience when shooting buildings and whatnot using quality glass. So let's zoom in, start with the bottom. Zooming in at 200, sharp, definitely sharp. This whole front building is sharp. And now looking at this other, you have a bit of fall off over here, but still overall, this is super sharp. Like I mentioned before, this is a really great walk around lens. It looks like we get a little, I mean, this is still pretty sharp, but we get a bit softer towards the top of the building. This part of it is definitely sharp, but it's a bit pushed back. So it's in line with the focal plane that is sharp. This building over here is sharp. So I think honestly, I've seen sharper lenses, but this is pretty quality. This shot is a good example of getting hyper close to an object. As you can see, this dark part of the photo here is the shadow of the lens. So I was pretty much, less than an inch away from this object, which is why I kept saying this lens has no minimum focal distance. And if we zoom in, not sharp there, but on this piece of glass, I mean, this is hyper sharp. We're at 200%. This is quality right here. Super sharp. and very extreme depth of field, very extreme fall off. Like this is its sharp area, and then the rest is complete fall off. But really impressive results for sure. And ending with this shot, I'm not sure how far I was away from this leaf, but if we zoom in, a large part of this leaf is just hyper sharp, and it's really cool. Obviously it's backlit, so this is just a pretty perfect scenario for this leaf, but this was the original. As you can see, I sharpened it a smidge. This is now back to 100%. Really nice drop off here. I think this is a really sharp lens. If I had to grade it, I'd give it like a 8.5 or 9 out of 10 for sharpness. So naturally, this is a great macro lens. We talked in depth about that, but this lens also doubles as a really great street lens. This lens is just so small and compact that it makes carrying it around super easy and enjoyable. And it's really discreet. So you're walking around taking pictures of maybe people and things and all of that, and you're not really drawing a ton of attention to yourself because it's kind of like a meep lens, you know, really small. And being a 2.8 with the crop factor applied, it's not really the best lens for night photography, but during the day, I mean, this is a phenomenal lens to walk around with. I've done it for the last 3 weeks, and I'm always happy to just grab this camera and head out the door. As a matter of fact, I'm prepping for a meet and I have to do daily walks in the morning, fasted. Every day, I just grab this camera, sling it around my back, and I just head out the door. And if I see something cool, I stop for a quick second and take a picture. It's just really easy to carry around. I would not do this with my GFX and the 50, even though that's the pancake for the GFX. It's just really large and not as enjoyable to carry around. So this lens really sings a different song, and it's really fun to bring around. So here are some of my favorite street shots. So to buy or not to buy? Well, that is the question. And the first answer I will give is if you are a new photographer or even new to the XF system, 100% don't think just buy this lens. You won't regret it. It's really sharp. It's got great bokeh. It is an insane macro lens. It basically has no minimum focal distance. I mean, you really can't go wrong with this lens. It's just a great all-around lens, especially if you are new to the XF system. It's also super light and easy to carry around, and the MSRP is $600. In terms of lens standards, I mean, that is just super cheap, especially for the quality of this lens. And the second way I'll answer that question is if you are already an XF photographer, you already have an XF camera, a couple lenses, maybe a lot of lenses. I mean, this is a pretty unique lens. If you like traveling around with your camera a lot and you want something really light, I mean, this is your lens. And again, at the price point of $600, I mean, you really can't go wrong with this lens. I definitely recommend picking it up. Personally speaking, I'm kind of done with XF gear for the most part, aside from gear that will help me make better videos for you guys. I am in a market for a new camera, but I haven't really decided if I want to pick up any new lenses. After trying this lens out, I'm kind of like trying to figure out how I can justify this, what reasoning I can have to pick up this lens, because it is really, really, really nice. I would definitely recommend this lens. Up next, I have a video on the X-T5 coming out, and even beyond that, I am making a choice between the XH2, XH2S, and the X-T5. So stay tuned, I'll take you along on my journey making that decision, what kind of reasoning I have. And that being said, if you haven't subscribed already, what are you waiting for? Please consider subscribing. It would help me out a ton as I'm trying to grow this channel. If you'd like to buy me a coffee, I have a link in the description for that, as well as some affiliate links for some Fujifilm gear. And with that being said, check out one of these videos next. If you enjoyed this video, hit that thumbs up button or even share the video. Thanks so much, and I'll catch you in the next one.